In a world ruled by herds of sheep wearing moral masks, only those who have the fangs of a wolf dare to live by the truth. Do you want to be loved or feared? Do you seek justice or power? The answer will be the man behind the mask. Niccolo Machiavelli's name is synonymous with cunning, deception, and ruthless ambition. To call someone Machiavellian is to accuse them of manipulation, of using others as pawns in a game where only power matters. He has been called the devil's advocate, a philosopher of evil, the father of modern political science, and a prophet of cold realism. Few thinkers in history have been so widely misunderstood and so disturbingly relevant. But who was Machiavelli, really? Born in 1469 in Florence, a city torn between competing powers and ideologies, Machiavelli came of age in a time of upheaval. Italy was not a unified nation, but a collection of warring city-states, each jockeying for influence. Florence itself oscillated between republicanism and tyranny, and its political fortunes were shaped as much by foreign invasion as by internal strife. It was a crucible of chaos and ambition, and Machiavelli, sharp-eyed, observant, and utterly unsentimental, watched it all. He wasn't born into nobility, he wasn't a soldier or a king. He was, at heart, a bureaucrat, a civil servant who rose through the ranks of Florence's Republican government, eventually becoming a senior diplomat. For over a decade, he traveled on behalf of the state, observing the courts of France, Germany, and most crucially, Rome. He studied power not as a philosopher might, from a distance, but from inside the machinery. He saw how decisions were made, how alliances were broken, how rulers lied, threatened, seduced, and killed to get what they wanted. And then, in 1512, he lost everything. When the Medici family returned to power in Florence, they purged the government of Republican loyalists. Machiavelli was arrested, tortured, and exiled. Stripped of his post, humiliated and broken, he retreated to the countryside. It was there, in the forced silence of political exile, that he wrote The Prince, the short, incendiary treatise that would define his legacy. The Prince is not a moral book. It's not about what's right, it's about what works. It argues without apology that power is not earned through goodness or idealism. It is seized and maintained through force, cunning, and fear. A successful ruler, Machiavelli tells us, must be willing to do evil when necessary. He must be able to lie, betray, and even kill, so long as it secures the state. And above all, he must appear virtuous, even when he is not. This isn't the counsel of a madman. It's the hard-won wisdom of a man who saw too much to believe in fairy tales. Machiavelli wasn't advocating cruelty for its own sake. He was advocating realism. He was saying, this is the world as it is. Do you want to survive in it or not? And yet, beneath this brutal logic, there is something profoundly human about Machiavelli. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who wanted order in a time of chaos, who longed for a strong and unified Italy, free from foreign domination. He saw how weak leadership, moral posturing, and idealistic dreaming led to ruin. The Prince was his attempt to wake his country up, to tell the hard truths no one wanted to hear. But people rarely thanked the messenger. For centuries, Machiavelli was reviled. The Catholic Church banned his books. Political theorists denounced him. Even Shakespeare painted him as a symbol of evil. And yet, despite, or perhaps because of, this vilification, his ideas endured. They were too sharp, too honest, too useful to ignore. Over time, thinkers began to recognize the brilliance in his cynicism. He wasn't corrupting politics, he was exposing it. What Machiavelli saw, and what still unsettles us, is that power obeys its own logic. It isn't bound by morality, religion, or law. It has its own gravity. And those who wish to master it must understand its rules. But that raises an uncomfortable question. If Machiavelli was right, then what does that say about us? Because if power really does favor the ruthless, the deceptive, the cold and calculating, then what chance does goodness have? What place is there for ethics, justice, or compassion in a world where success belongs to the most unscrupulous? This is the moral void at the heart of Machiavelli's thought. He doesn't try to fill it. He doesn't offer redemption. He simply stares into it and tells us to be ready. Part 2. Machiavelli's philosophy and the anatomy of power. Niccolo Machiavelli's most famous work, The Prince, was born not from a position of power, but from exile. After the Medici returned to power in Florence in 1512, Machiavelli was ousted, imprisoned, tortured, and ultimately exiled from public life. It was in this period of personal ruin that he authored the book that would secure his name in the annals of political philosophy and infamy. The Prince is not a long book, but its implications are far-reaching and deeply unsettling. It is not a manual for living a good life, but rather a brutal instruction manual for keeping and wielding power. It's not about being good, but about being effective. At the time, political thought was still tethered to Christian ideals. The prevailing wisdom held that a great leader was a moral one, wise, just, and virtuous in the Christian sense. But Machiavelli dismantled that notion completely. He separated politics from ethics with clinical precision. His claim was simple but profound. A ruler's success should not be measured by his goodness, but by his ability to maintain and expand his power, and in doing so, secure the stability of his state. A good leader, in Machiavelli's eyes, was not the one who acted morally, but the one who preserved order, by any means necessary. This perspective required a deliberate rejection of Christianity, not just as a personal belief system, but as a framework for governance. Machiavelli acknowledged the appeal of morality and honesty. He even seemed to respect them, but he believed that in the chaotic, unpredictable, and frequently violent realm of politics, morality was a luxury and often a liability. Sometimes doing what is right could get you killed, and more importantly, could unravel your state. To be effective, a leader must be willing to betray allies, deceive citizens, and use cruelty strategically. This was not just hypothetical theorizing. Throughout The Prince, Machiavelli holds up Caesar Borgia as a kind of prototype of political mastery. Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI, was carving out a new Italian state in the early 1500s. When he took the city of Cesena, Borgia left his lieutenant Ramiro de Lorca in charge. Ramiro imposed brutal order, executions, torture, property seizures. When Borgia returned and found the people seething with hatred toward Ramiro, and by extension toward him, he acted with calculated ruthlessness. Borgia had Ramiro executed, cut into pieces, and left his mutilated body on public display in the town square. He then told the citizens that Ramiro had acted without his consent and that he, Borgia, had saved them from a tyrant. It was, by any conventional measure, monstrous. But Machiavelli applauded it, not because he enjoyed cruelty, but because he saw the logic in it. Borgia created order through terror, and then cleansed himself of that terror by eliminating the scapegoat. The people were pacified. Stability was achieved. In Machiavelli's world, that was success. This leads to one of Machiavelli's most infamous conclusions. It is better to be feared than loved. Ideally, a ruler would be both. But in the real world, he argued, fear is more reliable. Love is fleeting, contingent, and fickle. People can change their minds, betray their loyalties, or simply act selfishly. But fear is concrete. Fear of punishment, of violence, of consequences. That lasts. Still, Machiavelli draws a line. A ruler must avoid being hated. Hatred is dangerous. It invites conspiracies and revolts. So the ideal ruler walks a narrow line. Inspire fear, but not hatred. Be ruthless, but not reckless. Importantly, Machiavelli did not think a leader needed to be virtuous, but he did think it was vital to appear virtuous. Reputation was everything. Most citizens, Machiavelli noted, would never see the inner workings of power. They wouldn't know the full truth of what their rulers did. All they would see were the public gestures, the speeches, the results. Therefore, a wise leader should speak of justice, charity, and honor, even if he privately violated all of them. This is where Machiavelli's realism turns especially chilling. He tells us again and again that people are not trustworthy. They are selfish, short-sighted, cowardly, and easily manipulated. So why should a ruler be honest with them? Why should he give up tools, deceit, manipulation, fear that his enemies will surely use? In this light, honesty becomes not a virtue, but a strategic error. To tell the truth is to forfeit an advantage. In a world of liars, the honest man is not noble. He is foolish. But Machiavelli's philosophy isn't just about cruelty and manipulation. Beneath the dark surface, there is a deeply pragmatic worldview that applies far beyond the palace walls. One of his most enduring concepts is the idea of virtu. It's a hard word to translate. It doesn't mean virtue in the modern moral sense. Instead, it refers to a kind of strength of character: boldness, willpower, adaptability, cleverness. Virtu is the quality that allows a person to bend circumstances to their will. It is whatever mix of traits lets you impose order on chaos. Virtu is constantly battling fortuna, another key idea in Machiavelli's writing. Fortuna means fortune, chance, fate, everything outside of your control. Machiavelli likens it to a wild river that floods unexpectedly, destroying villages. You cannot stop the river, but with preparation, you can build levees and dams. You can minimize the damage. Fortune rules half of our lives, he says, but the other half is ours to shape. This belief is, in its own way, empowering. Machiavelli doesn't think that God controls your fate. He doesn't believe in divine providence. Instead, he insists that you can shape your own destiny through skill, will, and action. Be bold, adapt quickly, act decisively. Don't count on morality or fate to save you. Count on your own cunning and resilience. This is where Machiavelli's realism veers into something else. Something darker, perhaps, but also undeniably insightful. He tells us that we must operate based on how the world is, not how we wish it to be. There is, he says, a dangerous gap between the ideal and the real. Those who live by ideals, who behave as if the world is fair and moral and just, are setting themselves up for failure. If you insist on playing by rules that no one else respects, you will be crushed. Instead, learn the real game and play it well. In this light, Machiavelli doesn't seem like a villain at all, just someone who has taken off the mask and shown us the machinery behind power. He isn't telling us to be cruel for cruelty's sake. He's telling us that in a world of betrayal, violence, and selfishness, naivety is fatal. To survive, and especially to lead, you must be prepared to fight in the dirt. And yet, for all his clarity, there is a contradiction at the heart of Machiavelli's life. He never truly achieved power himself. He never ruled a city, never led a military campaign, never built the kind of state he described in The Prince. If his book is a blueprint, it's one he never followed to its conclusion. His insights are sharp, but the man himself never became the kind of leader he so vividly imagined. Still, the ideas endured. And in that endurance, Machiavelli achieved a different kind of power, one that outlived kings and princes. Part 3. The Machiavellian Mirror. More than 5 centuries have passed since Niccolò Machiavelli penned The Prince. But the world he described, brutal, cunning, governed by appearances and ambition, feels less like a distant past than a living present tense. If anything, modern politics has become more Machiavellian, not less. The tools have changed: spin doctors instead of spies, social media instead of swordplay, but the instincts remain. Power still rewards those who understand perception, timing, and fear. Leaders still craft images carefully, sell illusions, build enemies, and cultivate loyalty, not through virtue, but through strength. Machiavelli did not invent these strategies, he merely revealed them. What makes his work dangerous is that he exposed the machinery of power without flinching. He described how the gears turn, how appearances matter more than substance, how people prefer comfort to truth, and how cruelty, when applied strategically, can create stability. He didn't offer judgment, only clarity. That is what makes him so subversive. And yet Machiavelli's legacy is more complex than his reputation suggests. He is best known for The Prince, but he wrote other, less infamous works, most notably Discourses on Livy, where he expresses admiration for republican forms of government, the rule of law, and civic virtue. In Discourses, he praises the Roman Republic for its balance of powers and its citizen soldiers, and he argues that freedom, not fear, creates lasting greatness. It is a very different Machiavelli, one who speaks not to tyrants, but to citizens. So which is the real Machiavelli? The cold strategist of The Prince, or the Republican idealist of Discourses? The answer is both. Machiavelli was a political realist, not a moralist. His loyalty was to effectiveness, not consistency. He wrote to different audiences, in different contexts, with different purposes. The Prince was a survival manual for a would-be ruler in chaotic times. Discourses was a broader meditation on how republics thrive. He understood that different political situations require different tools, and that no single doctrine can account for the chaos of real life. To read Machiavelli is to be confronted with ambiguity. He forces us to consider that virtue and effectiveness may not always align, that a good person may be a terrible leader, and that a cruel ruler may bring peace. He reminds us that moral purity without competence is often useless and sometimes fatal. In modern democracies, this challenge is more pressing than ever. We like to believe that power should belong to the good, that justice and truth win in the end, that history rewards integrity. But Machiavelli would ask, how often is that really the case? How often do we reward competence over charisma, action over appearance, substance over spectacle? Consider the modern political stage. Leaders are judged less by what they accomplish than by how they perform. Speeches are crafted for optics. Policies are shaped by polling. Outrage is manufactured. Enemies are constructed. Behind closed doors, the same calculations Machiavelli described. How to manipulate allies, silence critics, and stay in power are still very much alive. We like to call this cynicism, but Machiavelli would call it honesty. This is what makes his work so enduring. He doesn't tell us how the world should be, he tells us how it is. And in doing so, he forces us to confront the distance between our ideals and our reality. It's tempting to dismiss this as a dark worldview, but there's something liberating in Machiavelli's frankness. He refuses to lie to us. He doesn't sugarcoat power. He shows us its costs, its rules, its temptations. And he gives us language to describe what we already feel, but rarely say, that politics is often about survival, not virtue, about strategy, not sincerity. But even Machiavelli, the arch-pragmatist, knew there were limits. He never advocated chaos for its own sake. He never glorified cruelty without cause. His ideal ruler is not a sadist, but a tactician. Someone who uses cruelty with precision and restraint, never wastefully. And always he returns to the idea of stability. His ultimate concern is the survival of the state, the preservation of order, the creation of conditions where people can live in peace, even if that peace is built on ugly foundations. In this way, Machiavelli is not just a thinker of power, he is a thinker of responsibility. Because if power is as dangerous and deceptive as he says, then those who wield it must be even more careful, even more thoughtful, even more aware of its risks. The prince may be feared, but he must never be hated. He must understand timing, restraint, and the art of perception. He must keep power not just for himself, but for the stability of the whole. That's a heavy burden, and one we often forget. Too often, Machiavelli is used as a justification for corruption, deception, and raw self-interest. But those who invoke his name without understanding his nuance do him, and themselves, a disservice. Machiavelli never argued that all means are justified. He argued that some means, though terrible, may be necessary, and that morality, if it blinds us to necessity, can become its own kind of violence. In the end, The Prince is not a prescription. It is a provocation. It asks us to think critically about power, to look beyond slogans and ideals, to recognize how easily we are manipulated by appearances, and how fragile virtue can be in the face of fear. It reminds us that leadership is not about purity, it is about judgment. And judgment, in a world as flawed and chaotic as ours, is always a tightrope walk. So what can we learn from Machiavelli today? We can learn to be skeptical, but not cynical, to be realistic, but not resigned, to understand power not as something evil, but as something dangerous, like fire or a loaded weapon, that must be handled with care. We can learn that good intentions are not enough, that character matters, but competence matters more, that strong institutions are more reliable than strong men, and that transparency, accountability, and public trust are the only real antidotes to the dark side of Machiavellian politics. Above all, we can learn to see clearly, to recognize the game without being seduced by it, to understand manipulation without embracing it, to walk the line between moral clarity and political intelligence. That is the Machiavellian task, not to become tyrants, but to understand how tyrants think